Something interesting starts to happen after age 50. The life you've built still works, but parts of it begin to feel like they don't quite fit anymore. Not wrong, just slightly out of alignment with who you've become. And most advice, we hear it all the time, tells women this means they need to reinvent themselves, right? But what if that's the wrong idea entirely? What if midlife doesn't ask us to reinvent our lives, but to edit our lives? Hello, my friends. I'm Sharri Harmel, and this is your next chapter, where we talk about creating a life that feels grounded, intentional, and deeply our own, especially in midlife. Now, last week, I talked about something that women began noticing after age 50. That one thing that, worked for us, or many things that worked for us when we were younger, but suddenly quietly stop working, right? And that realization truly led to a very interesting question. So if midlife isn't asking us to start over, what exactly are we meant to change, right? Because editing doesn't mean shrinking our lives. Think of it like the memoir that you could write today. Editing that memoir doesn't mean you totally taken out many, many different chapters. It's not about shrinking it. It's about refining it. And I first began noticing this in a very unexpected place. See if you can guess from the montage. When I began spending more time in Paris, I noticed something that stayed with me. And that was that Parisian women really weren't thinking about or even talking about constantly reinventing themselves. They weren't chasing that next version of who they were supposed to be. In many ways, that's a very American thing, I think, to do. Instead, these women seem to be refining their lives, figuring out how could I maybe update my home a little bit? How could I get a better rhythm to my day? How can I spend more time with the people that are important to me? And it made me realize something, and that is that midlife isn't the moment where we reinvent ourselves. Maybe it's the moment that we finally begin editing our lives. We have the opportunity and the luxury to edit our lives. So, on that topic of editing, I think midlife quietly asks us to make four different kinds of edits. At least that's how I define it. Some happen in the outer structure of our lives, and some happen internally. So let's start with the first, and that is our time. The first place where editing often begins after age 50 is our time. When we were younger, our lives expanded outward, right? Children, careers, commitments, obligations, we said yes to everything. It was a chapter of, yes, I can do that. But midlife introduces a new awareness, and time becomes much more precious. We're starting to see maybe there's a little bit less in front of us than there is behind us. So time, editing time, I should say, might start to sound like, I don't know that I want to do that. Fewer obligations, fewer rush days, fewer things that we maybe automatically would have said yes to before. Now, that doesn't mean our lives are less or that they're less exhilarating or fun or engaging. It just means it's more intentional. Our lives in midlife and beyond become much more intentional. Now, another place where editing time quietly appears is in I should say, around the people that we choose to spend our time with. And I'll be honest, this has not been an easy switch, not been an easy edit for me. There have been moments when I knew in a prior chapter that a relationship was no longer working. Sometimes it was a friendship, sometimes it was someone who was working with me or someone who was working for me. Ending those relationships was very, very difficult. I'm a person like many of you who cares deeply about people. And so ending relationships is hard. But what I realized, which was incredibly, I think, enlightening, was that the amount of time and emotional energy I was spending trying to manage that relationship was suddenly free. When I ended the relationship that was no longer working, suddenly that time opened up in my life and subsequently that energy. And that leads to the second edit I think that we have to think about in our lives, and that is about energy. Because if someone or something keeps taking up our time when it no longer should be a part of our life, it drains our energy. Truly. We don't have the energy we had before. I used to be able to schedule appointment after appointment after appointment. I could switch gears, put on different hats. I can't do that anymore. And I think that's something that makes us even more aware of how we're spending our energy or what kind of energy is available. And it's closely connected to our time. Nothing deserves our energy that it depletes our energy at this point. I shouldn't say that. I should say nothing that we can eliminate out of our lives should we continue to keep in our lives just because it's always been there, because our energy is incredibly important. I talked about this in another video recently, and the video was all about my mistake in making a move back to Minnesota to be closer to my adult children and grandchildren, and how, I'm still close to my children, but they moved, they got new relationships, life went on for them. And suddenly I was sitting in a place that didn't fuel me, a place that didn't feel like it was actually, I felt like I was shrinking in that place. And I think that's really, really important. I moved back to Boston and life is good. But that video is important. And if any of you are considering moving to where your grandchildren or your children are, do watch that video because I think it's something to think about. And that is that our environment around us, the cities we live in, the homes we live in, all of that very much so impacts our energy. And if we place ourselves in an environment that doesn't nourish us, even for a very loving reason, right? It can feel incredibly heavy over time. And energy is the fuel we need. It's the fuel of a life well lived, regardless of your chapter. And midlife teaches us to really spend that fuel wisely. Now, another area where edits have to happen, and this can be hard too, and that is in our surroundings. Our homes become calmer, our wardrobes become simpler, the objects we keep, I think, begin to become more meaningful, not more things. So, and sometimes this is hard because we don't see the things around us. I was just talking with a friend of mine about it, that we don't see how we have cluttered up our spaces with all kinds of old things that we've kept, things we can't get rid of, things we can't put away. I experienced this when I moved into this apartment in Boston because I had a storage unit here. And so I had accumulated things from all my different chapters of life, right? And suddenly, it was floor to ceiling boxes in here, let me tell you. And suddenly I had to ask myself, how do I want to live now? Because this space, we all had homes when we raised children that had multiple bedrooms because we needed them. And once we get to a certain age, we don't need them anymore. So what do we do with all that stuff? That stuff from our prior chapters. I had boxes and boxes of things around me, and we won't even talk about the books. But as I unpacked, something interesting happened. And that is that I didn't want to recreate my past. I didn't want to fill every shelf and every commode top with stuff. And so I started to edit. Some things stayed, some things quietly went away, some things went to my children's homes, some things I just gave away. And slowly my apartment became calmer, became more reflective of the chapter that I'm currently living in. And we won't even talk about the fact that at some point our children may be going through our homes. And is this what we want to leave behind? So let me just say, editing a home is often the easiest place to begin editing a life. Now, the final area where edits happen is probably one of the harder, only from the standpoint that it's unconscious, and that is our identity. And our identity comes from all of the different roles that we've played in our lives. I was a mother. You might have been a professional, career woman, maybe a caretaker, a supreme problem solver. I can relate to that. And when we move to this next chapter, some of those roles kind of fall by the wayside. And many women, I know I did, began asking the question, who am I? Who am I now? And something important happens to you. And I want to say that even though those roles may no longer be active in our daily lives, they don't disappear. Some of us were mothers who raised children. Some of us were leaders in the workplace and were surrounded by colleagues. Some of us were wives. Some of us were partners, whatever it might have been. Those roles don't vanish. They become chapters, I want to say, in the book of our lives. Think of it as the memoir that you would write today of your life is all those different chapters of identities that you stepped into at those particular chapters of your life. And they make up the identity of the woman that we are today. The wisdom we carry today is because of all of those roles we played in our past. It's a perspective that we've earned. And so I don't want you to be sad because editing identity doesn't mean that we lose ourselves. It just means that we are more than the roles we once held. And now we are choosing deliberately about what we care about, what we pursue, what we no longer carry. And that is what creates the identity that we hold today in our midlife and beyond. Now, if this idea of editing resonates with you, here's something I want you to consider. Where in your life might one small edit change everything? Not a dramatic reinvention, just one thoughtful adjustment. Because often the smallest edits, like our tiny habits, create the greatest sense of calm. Now, midlife, as we all know, isn't about adding more and more. It's about refining what remains. And when we begin editing our lives with intention, life, honestly, begins to feel lighter, clearer, more deliberate. We know where we're going. We know where we want to go. It's a good feeling. So if this conversation resonates with you, I want you to know that I explore these ideas more over in Substack every single week. And then if you want to go even deeper, in Substack, there's something that I have called the Next Chapter Salon. So check it out. Both are linked below. And I'd love to hear from you. Where in your life are you beginning to edit? And after 50, remember, the goal isn't to build a completely new life. It's to edit the one you've already earned until it finally fits. I'll see you next week, everyone. A bientôt.